Book 91 of 2019 was Science of Storytelling by Will Storr. So the reason I bought this book was because I'd read another book by Will Storr called Selfie that was published in 2017, and it was really good, really, really interesting. Loved reading it, and I couldn't wait to read something else of his. And so that's why I got this book. It's only just been released, so I was really excited to read it, and then it just wasn't as good. So I was really disappointed by that. Essentially what this book is about is it says the science of storytelling. It's not really a science, I guess, but it's kind of like the process of storytelling, or what makes good storytelling. So it kind of breaks it down into its constituent parts and kind of says like what makes a good story, and then like basically so that you can apply it to writing your own story. It's kind of more of a here's how to do it, no you go and do it kind of book. It's kind of implied that you're about to write one kind of thing. So it goes through a few kind of things, and it's funny actually because as I was writing on my board of what I was going to talk about during this review, I was reading like the review that I wrote after I'd read the book, and as I was kind of like going through and trying to summarise it for this video, I was thinking of a book that I'm currently reading at the minute, and I was thinking, yeah, this book does these things, and this is what is actually good about the book. So he's obviously talking sense, and he's obviously looked at a lot of successful stories and come up with this kind of like science of it, if you will. So one of the things that he says is that if you want to tell a really, really good story, you've got to focus on the characters rather than the plot. So everything's got to be about that character or about those characters, and not so much on kind of what is happening as a plot. If you think about like action films are plot driven, and whilst they're good for a particular type of audience or a particular kind of person that wants that kind of film, they do lack that characterization, and I always find myself wanting, when I watch films like that, and wish that there was more to them. And similarly in books as well, books that are plot driven are never as good as character driven books. And in character driven books, the plot's sometimes not that good, but you still like the book because the character's so interesting. You're around people. So I guess that is something that you can adopt to make your stories better. He also says that all good stories start with an unexpected change. If you think of Harry Potter, the Philosopher's Stone, he suddenly finds out he's a wizard, so there's an unexpected change. I'm reading a book at the minute, and it started off as a bank robbery. Something that occurs right at the beginning, there's an unexpected change. Another book that I'm also reading at the minute, she accidentally kills somebody. So there's an unexpected change that then kind of gets you to kind of reassess your life. So that was something that he kind of mentioned that is a clincher when you're thinking of good stories. He kind of tries to incorporate like brain studies to kind of support like what he's saying, and in terms of like what the brain likes. And some of these are done well and some of them are not done well, so I'll kind of explain. He talks about how the brain likes to be curious and likes intrigue, and as a person you kind of want to uncover the character or the plot. You don't want to be told everything, so you want to kind of work it out for yourself. It's always kind of like when you're not quite sure what the answer is, but you can kind of guess, but you could be wrong. He says that's the kind of situation that you want your readers to feel that they're in. And he calls those information gaps. So by putting kind of gaps in the story, the person reading it can't know everything, and there's lots of things that they want to fill in. So if you can kind of drop those in as the story unfolds, and if other characters can fill in those information gaps, that will create a great story. And it's funny actually because the story I'm reading at the minute, so I'm reading The Messenger by the guy who wrote the book Thief, but I can't remember his full name, so I'm not going to try and say it because I don't think I can pronounce it anyway. I think he's called Mark maybe. So he, in his story, I don't actually want to spoil it, but this guy kind of gets these playing cards, and there's kind of messages on them, and he's got to kind of do them, or he gets beat up. And there's characters that drop him, that give him messages give him messages, because they're messengers as well, to him, and it's like each character's giving him a bit more information, fills those information gaps in, and it does work. It's a good device that's employed in that book. So you kind of want to get your readers into a situation where they anticipate the outcome, but that their expectations are violated, and that actually it's some other kind of conclusion. I always remember actually reading like Dan Brown books, and you always thought you knew what was going on, and you always thought you knew who was the killer or who was after who, and it turns out that it was someone completely different. There was a massive twist, and you're like, oh, didn't even see that come in. They're the best books, so that, you know, obviously has something to it. He also suggests that if you've got a situation where you've got several accounts of something and they all contradict each other, and that you as a reader have got to work out what the correct answer or what the correct thing has happened, that is more interesting. And it's funny actually, because I watched a film called Vantage Point, and it did that. It kind of gave a story from each person's vantage. And I think they were all kind of showing the same thing, but like if it was in a book and everyone did it kind of slightly differently. And I think they do that actually in Game of Thrones. I think somebody said one time that there's quite a few, and obviously the Gospels are like that as well. Not to suggest that they're stories, but I guess they are. And so that kind of makes it more interesting. He also mentions about kind of storytelling via other media, so not just so much in stories and literature, because obviously storytelling is an oral tradition anyway, you know, from days gone by. So he's kind of like, you know, talking about that as well. But he talks about it in film. So in Hollywood films, they actually present things based on the saccades of the eyes, so how the eyes move, which I thought was really interesting. And that they tend to kind of focus on salient details. I don't know if you watched a Quentin Tarantino film, but they always focus on quite like close-ups of certain things. And they do it actually in Maniac, which is a show on Netflix. They focus on salient things, and obviously you've got the influence of colour and stuff as well. I'm sure if you're a media studies nerd, you'll probably know all this stuff. And he suggests that it adds kind of richness by focusing on salient details. And it also provides like juxtapositions or stretches time. So for example, if you have watched Jurassic Park, like the cup that starts to shake as the you know, the dinosaurs are coming through, it adds that kind of juxtaposition and that stretch of time. Now, he also kind of referred to some evidence. He said that Russians see more colours in a rainbow than other cultures, because Russians define blue with two different terms, whereas we would just define it as blue. And I kind of listened to this and I thought, that's not right. I was like, a different culture can have different names for things, fine, but what your eyes actually see is the same. Like, you have the same like rods and cones in your eyes, so you know, rods for black and white, cones for colour. You've got the same cones. Like, you can't see different colours to somebody else. Like, your eyes are the same unless you're colourblind. So yeah, you might conceptualise things differently. You know, you could call an orange an apple, and you know, depending on culture, it's going to change, isn't it? So I looked into it online, and it's a myth. So he was wrong, and so I just thought, you've wrote a book and you've not double checked this fact. You've not like actually looked at it and gone into it, unless, you know, there is some research out there that he's used. I don't know, because he's not actually putting any references in, because I listened to it on audio. I don't know if he has in the actual book or not, but he didn't, like, he just said like, it was like research, and I'm like, yeah, okay. So I kind of questioned actually his authenticity in terms of that, because I was thinking, what else in this book is he not fact checked? Is there other things in there that he said that is actually not right? He mentions that you should write in a transitive way, so you should use more active voice rather than passive voice. And it's interesting actually, because I teach this to my students now when I'm teaching like academic writing, and I kind of say it's easier to visualize something in active voice than it is in passive voice. So for example, in the book, the example is Jane gave a kitten to her father. Now, if you were to say the kitten was given to the father by Jane, it doesn't make sense. Like, when you're trying to, like, the sequence of it doesn't kind of make sense. In my example that I give my students is better. So I kind of say, if I said to you, imagine the ball was taken out of the box by the experimenter. You're imagining a ball just floating, and then there's a box around it, and then you imagine the experimenter. Whereas that's kind of like passive voice. If I used active voice and I was like the experimenter took the ball out of the box, you're imagining it in sequence, so it makes more sense. So you can read it quicker, and your readers will be able to imagine what you're trying to create a lot better. So he uses that as a tip. He also suggests that adjectives should show rather than tell. So that's a more effective way of storytelling. And it is interesting, this actually, because there was a book that I read called Little Fires Everywhere, which was awful because it just told you everything. It didn't show you anything. It just explicitly told you everything. And so there was no opportunity for intrigue or curiosity or for you to work anything out. It was just all, here it is. And so it was rubbish. Now, if it had been done in a different way, if the adjectives had been showing and implying rather than just explicitly outlining, then it would have been a better book. So that's kind of unfortunate that some authors don't kind of recognise that. He also suggests, Storr also suggests, if you kind of write about a character and what they think another character thinks about another character, and you employ kind of like second and third order theory of mind, it becomes a lot more interesting because there's those kind of overlaps between characters, and it's not just one dimensional, it's thinking about other people's viewpoints of other characters. American Psycho does this quite well because you have the perspective of Pat Bateman, who is the psychopath, but then you have the responses from the other people, so you have what he thinks of them and then how they're behaving in relation to him, so then you can think what they're actually thinking. It made it really interesting by having that kind of crossover. Storr also says that the most successful stories are the ones where the characters are completely three-dimensional, so you know everything about these characters, you know them. So if you're writing them, you know them better than you know yourself, better than you know the people. You know, like, what drives them. You know what childhood experiences has made them into who they are. You know their strengths, their weaknesses. You know their goals. You know their kind of worldview. You know how they relate to other people, what they think about other people, what they think about, you know, everything that's going on around them, what they think about work, etc., etc. You need to know everything about them and how they would respond for them to come across as a three-dimensional character. If as a writer you don't know those things before you start writing, you won't write them as well because you won't know, so you'll just be writing a kind of empty character that you'll flesh out with details because you think that they're necessary for the plot, which a lot of writers fall into the trap of doing, which makes it poor. They're not three-dimensional characters if you write them like that. He also suggests that you need an ignition point. So I kind of briefly mentioned this at the beginning when I said that all good stories start with an unexpected change. You need something that makes the character question their initial beliefs that they had, or makes them kind of think about an event that's happened to them in childhood that's had an effect on them that they can now reflect and change, or like something that questions the way that they're living their life so that they can readdress that. So that's what's happening in the one at the minute that I'm reading, The Messenger. So something's got to kind of happen for the story to kind of begin, for the good stories. Obviously, Storr is suggesting the components of good storytelling, and I found myself agreeing with a lot of the things that he was saying because I'm well read. I've read a lot of stories, and my favourite ones do a lot of these things and are successful because of a lot of these things. So it was nice to have, you know, whenever you have an opinion about a book, you're like, yeah, I like a book, but you can't really pinpoint why it is that you liked it, why it was so successful. And I think Storr does a good job of outlining those things of potential reasons for why books are good and why they're not good, or why stories are good and why they're not good. So it was kind of interesting for that reason, and it's interesting if you actually want to write a novel, or a, you know, a novella, if whatever you want to write, story-wise, short story, whatever. So I was going to say I can't pronounce that word though. A vignette. It's spelled vignette, isn't it? But it's not vignette. I don't know. French word, isn't it? So anyway, I'm rambling now. What was I going to say? Yeah, I don't think I rated it very high because I was so disappointed in comparison with Selfie, because I was expecting it to be a lot better. But it was interesting, apart from the bit that he got wrong about the rainbow stuff. But I only know that because I teach stuff like that. So you might not have picked up on it. Maybe everything else is okay in there. I'm not quite sure. So, you know, if you're interested in it, then give it a go.